Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to some more Warhammer fantasy lore, where today we're going to be having a look at the Empire's Colleges of Magic. And they most certainly are a worthwhile entity to peer upon because, whilst they're not unique in the entirety of the Warhammer world, they're not far from it. There are very, very few places in the Warhammer world that are quite as progressive when it comes to the treatment of those with a magical inclination as the Empire. And to put that into a little bit of perspective, the Colleges of Magic are essentially an organization that de facto imprisons mages. Now, it's a golden cage, don't get me wrong, but if you are not a part of the colleges and you attempt to practice magic without their sanction, your local witch hunter is going to be knocking on your door rather insistently, and if you are exceedingly lucky, he will give you a chance to join the Colleges of Magic, and if you are not lucky, extremely lucky, then he'll simply just kill you, and probably parade your corpse through the town and then burn it in the village square, just to make absolutely certain. And once you are a member of the Colleges of Magic, you are pretty much bound to stay within the colleges until they decide that you are sufficiently learned to go out into the wider world, and even when you go out into aforementioned wider world, you do so in the service of the Empire, either as a part of its military or as a part of its wider state forces. You are a state wizard, the implication being quite obvious in the title. You are not a free individual. Now, again, golden cage, you are given a fair bit of privileges, you are allowed to continue your research as you see fit, you are also given a relatively generous stipend, and if you manage to make it further up the ladder, yet further funds and research abilities open up to you. By no means is it a gulag, but it isn't freedom either. And yet, the wizards in the Empire have it about as well as pretty much any set of mortal sorcerers could ever hope to have it in the civilized world. Most other places, magic casters, be they wizards or sorcerers, be they amethyst wizards or jade wizards, regardless of their specialization or their inclination, are usually just killed. Indeed, a great deal of people who aren't magical in the slightest are also frequently beaten, murdered, and burned to death because somebody somewhere thought that maybe, just maybe, they saw them casting magic. Magic in and of itself is deeply feared within most of the established Warhammer world, with the exception of the more chaotic quarters, obviously, where, well, magic is still feared, but it is a fearful respect more so than the just outright fear and anger that we see in the softer southern lands. And this is not without reason. It isn't merely just narrow-minded prejudice that caused the peasant populace of the old world to find and introduce any wizard they find to a roaring bonfire. There are most definitively practical reasons behind this. It isn't just the fear or lack of understanding of magic. Your average mage is obviously a hell of a lot more dangerous than your average pig farmer, although an untrained sorcerer is unlikely to summon forth all that much in the way of destructive potential. Still, you know, curses, magical attacks, such things, voodoo hoodoo, these are real and dangerous forces. But the thing that makes magic users so very dangerous has nothing to do necessarily with their own magic powers. Rather, their lack of control over aforementioned magic. Because all magic users weave together the raw stuff of chaos, the stuff of the warp, the immaterium, the realms of the gods. And very few of them really understand that this is what they are doing, or even if they have some inclination, they are usually completely and utterly blind to the scale of the mountain of shit that they are so enthusiastically prodding and hoping won't come crashing down upon them. The warp, of course, is the realm of the Chaos Gods, very, very bad dudes, and their legions of other bad dudes. They are kept out of our world due to a thin veil of reality. Essentially, a demon cannot manifest in the real world. It is a literal impossibility. But the raw stuff of magic is the kind of shit that makes the impossible possible. It literally shifts reality. This would allow a demon to exist in an area suffused with chaos magic, potentially indefinitely, or in an area of relative suffusion for a period of time. But slowly but surely this energy will begin to dissipate and be forced back into the immaterium, and with it, the demonic entity, unless it has some way, or finds some way, of providing itself with extra energy. This is where the mages come in. Every time a mage casts a spell, even something super banal and simple, you could, for example, have an old wise woman living out in the woods, and she is renowned to the local villagers as a peddler of magical medicines. She will suffuse her potions and elixirs with just the tiniest hint of magic, giving it its effect. Now, this is, in all due likelihood, nothing dangerous whatsoever. The odds of such a minor ritual getting out of control are pretty tiny. To bring up a illustrative example, let us say that a demon requires a bucketful of magical energy to appear, and the ritual required to infuse a love potion with the ability to marginally increase the target's attraction towards the user. That might just be a handful of droplets, if even that. A medicine to cure gout might be a little bit more. A medicine to potentially regrow a lost limb? Now we're starting to talk volume here, but by and large your average village wise woman will not have access to that kind of knowledge regardless. However, if she were ever to try and tap into rituals that she did not understand, and, well, this is the fact. This is the problem with them not actually knowing what they're doing. Aforementioned village wise woman might simply, and I need to not say W too much, because then my Norwegian kicks in and I go like, "Wise," or something like that. Anywho, she knows these recipes because they've been passed down from generation to generation, and probably a fair bit of her own testing and experimenting as well, where she will unknowingly infuse her experiments with just the tiniest prickle of magical power. This is why the elixir of a wise woman may have actual effect, whereas the precise same elixir brewed by some random girl would have no effect. But eventually, this wise woman, not knowing what she's dealing with, she doesn't understand what magic is, what chaos is, or anything like that, she might decide to experiment a little bit further. Alright, she says, I know that there are spirits of magic, and they help me make my bed medicine. Alright. Working off that line of logic, could I not perhaps entreat them to do something a little bit more grand for me? Maybe I could even summon forth one of these spirits. And she then gets going with the experiment. Until potentially, eventually, she manages to summon one of her spirits. Except it's not what she was looking for. The little spirit, quote-unquote, that gave her the power to cure various diseases, for example, that she now tries to contact in earnest, may very well be a demonic entity of the Plague Father, the Chaos God Nurgle. This entity may find it amusing to give this woman the cure for a minor disease, perhaps in a petulant rivalry with another disease demon, or perhaps in an effort to infuse a more serious disease into the wider community by going like, oh yes, this will cure that, and then staying quiet about the fact that it will also introduce the plague to the populace and stuff like this. If she succeeds in summoning this entity, then all bets are off. Maybe she gets it just right and summons just a minor nurgling or some other tiny entity, harmless. It might kill the wise woman, in which case, well, you got what you deserve, and the demon got a light snack. If she misjudges the amount of power, however, and opens up a rift in reality, then considerably more than one Nurgling might get through it. And that, well, how do I put it? Such a thing could range in the level of seriousness from the witch's hut being burned down or being turned into a giant unnatural rotting pustule, releasing clouds of toxic vapor into the nearby area, rotting trees and killing local animals, to the level of disaster of a stable warp rift appearing, through which dozens upon dozens of demons can pour through and have their merry, happy little way with the local village populace, resulting in the wholesale slaughter of the entire population, and, if everybody is particularly unlucky, it'll summon a being capable of harvesting that anger, that energy, that hatred, that fear, into yet further warp rifts. At that point, all bets are pretty much off. Shit is about to get really, really interesting for the local lord, and hopefully his considerable staff of witch hunters, because he's gonna need them. This, of course, a bit more of an extreme example, and it doesn't happen particularly often. The more advanced a wizard's knowledge about the winds of magic, on the one hand, the more likely he is to be able to understand and control it, but on the other, the more likely he is also to be a little bit overconfident and misjudge the limits of his control. This can lead to pretty damn considerable problems. This is why people just kill them most of the time, unless they prove to be particularly useful and trustworthy. The wise woman is an excellent example of this. Someone who seems to genuinely provide magical elixirs and has never hurt anyone. Right, well, there's a decent chance the local community might ignore her, or even go so far as to go like, "Oh, Mr. Witch Hunter, no, that old fisher's wife never hurt anyone. Magic? No. Alchemy." Or some such nonsense, trying to cover for her. Other, more sinister forms of wizards could of course be those who experiment in alchemy, actual alchemy, turning lead into gold and such nonsense, without understanding that when they're doing this process, they're actually entreating demonic entities for their aid in warping reality. And of course the most insidious of all, being those who know perfectly well what they're doing, and in fact are betting on their ability to summon demonic entities, perhaps through some misguided notion that they might be able to control them or benefit from their presence in some way. Hell, there might even be certain cults who are actively trying to summon demons precisely because they want to eradicate parts of local society. Not the nicest of people, this. And so, throughout most of the world, magic users are hunted down and killed, and only those powerful enough to hide or make use of themselves survive. Either in the case of the local wise woman, or perhaps in the court of a local noble who might see the value in an experienced wizard, if he has, for example, ambitions on his neighbor's territory. The ability to lob giant fireballs at his army could prove handy indeed, or cast a nice little spell that will turn the ruler of the nearby land into a particularly large and unkissable frog, for example. But this, of course, all changed within the Empire, with the creation of the colleges of magic. So how exactly did they manage to turn all of this around? How did they make the general populace understand the need, the necessity, and the benefits of mages, to the point of organizing them officially and even giving them privileges such as ranks, statures, stipends, and research funds? That is, after all, quite the change from purging them actively. Well, it all happened with the rise of a certain citizen of Newlyn, who would eventually become known as Magnus the Pious. He began his career by cleansing the city of Newlyn of a chaotic cult. And in so doing, he recognized the danger of chaos and chaotic magic. He would then go on to lead a crusade through the Empire, which was at this point a very much so fractured nation, ruled over by local barons, nobles, and elector counts that had each elected their own puppet emperor, or even, indeed, rejected the entire imperial system completely and maintained their own independence, either until somebody worthy would rise to the top, or secretly hoping that they could perhaps stay independent forever. With the coming of Magnus, however, he managed to reunite the Empire. And just in time, too, as a great storm of chaos was about to be unleashed upon the world. The conflict that was to become known as the Great War Against Chaos. This was hardly the first Great War, but as far as the humans of the Empire were concerned, it was. It was a massive and extraordinarily significant conflict to them, and the first to feel the wrath of the Chaos Gods was the Empire's northern ally, Kislev. Its northernmost city and bastion against the Chaos Hordes, Prague, had recently been overrun after offering valiant, if futile, resistance. Magnus, realizing that he could not allow Kislev to fall, lest the Empire be the next target, went north in an effort to organize a major army to fight against the Chaos Hordes. And whilst on his journey and organizing his army, he ran into 3 High Elf Law Masters. Or, well, ran into. More like, they ran into him. Very purposefully so, in all due likelihood. These 3 High Elf mages, who just happened to be wandering through the Empire at the time, was Teclis, one of the most powerful High Elf mages to have ever lived, Fenrir, and Irtla. The 3 sought a personal audience with Magnus, who they knew for a long period of time now had had some misgivings. After having put down the Chaos cult in Newlyn, he knew just how powerful Chaos magic could be, and he frankly had no real idea how he could fight against it. The priests of the Empire and of the wolf god Ulrich were convinced that their own holy prayers, not magic, mind you, prayers, might be able to counteract the more vile effects of the dark god's magics, but Magnus was not entirely convinced. And the 3 High Elf mages had arrived to tell him that maybe, just maybe, fire was best fought with fire. They proposed to him the radical idea, and it absolutely was a radical notion, that the Empire could begin training its own mages. And again, I mean, this may seem logical. Well, surely you'd want mages on your side, right? Fireballs and all that. Well, yes, but as I talked about previously, mages were considered exceptionally dangerous in the Empire by pretty much all of its citizens. And to suggest that they could be controlled or trained, or hell, even to suggest that they should be tolerated in the first place, oh, that most definitively was a notion well and truly outside of the norm. And if it had been anyone but Magnus trying to implement this, they would almost certainly have failed. Only he had the popular support to convince the general populace that this was a necessary and worthwhile goal, and only he had the necessary political acumen to turn this popular support into political capital, with which to persuade and, if needs be, blackmail his opposition. The witch hunters, of course, were not particularly enthused by the idea, nor were the various Templar orders of knights, many of which had more or less dedicated themselves to the eradication of magic within the Empire. But again, Magnus was Magnus, and Magnus was a boss, and he managed to convince them, or at the very least, convinced them to keep their mouths shut for long enough to officially establish the colleges of magic under the purview and guarantee of Teclis. Though bear in mind, at this point in time, this organization that was to eventually become the Colleges of Magic were not officially known as such. Magnus did not yet have the official power or the political clout to establish them fully. Instead, he convinced the various other organizations within the Empire that this was going to be a temporary measure, all the whiles planning to make it anything but. Teclis would make sure that only those that were suitable were allowed in, and as an overture to the witch hunters, he also promised to do a bit of their job for them. If any mages within the Empire refused to turn themselves over, or were deemed to be irreversibly corrupted by Teclis, he personally would end their lives. That was just about enough to get the witch hunters on side, however temporarily. And thusly, with official backing secured, the three elven mages began the process of scouring the Empire for candidates for their colleges. This would normally have proved to be an extraordinarily difficult task. The mages of the Empire were painfully aware of the fate that awaited them if their magical talents became known to the general populace, and even more painfully aware of the long and drawn-out death that would undoubtedly await them should the witch hunters learn of their particular fetish for things that go whoosh and whash and flashes in the dark. And they had, of course, therefore buried themselves deep, deep, deep within, or occasionally without, imperial society, setting up secret towers and bases deep in the wilderness or far out in the forests. This kind of lifestyle provided its own challenges and dangers, but hey, beastmen are not witch hunters. And if you were to ask the average wizard which one he would rather deal with, I'm pretty sure he'd opt for the beastmen. At least them you might be able to scare off. But whilst these tactics may have been effective against the witch hunters and the Templars, they failed to take into account one very important detail. And to be fair, they had no way to really prepare for this, or know that it was even necessary to prepare for it. These were human wizards, living in a human world with, albeit extensive by human standards, knowledge of magic. It all absolutely paled in comparison to the understanding of magic possessed by Teclis and his brethren. They were easily able to scry the entirety of the Empire for anyone engaged in even the slightest hint of magical efforts. They would then dispatch dreams to them, compelling them to travel to the city of Talabheim and surrender themselves to Empire authorities, whereupon which they would be judged by Teclis and his brethren. Those who were deemed to be sufficiently pure would then become the very first recruits of the Colleges of Magic. Those who were deemed to be impure or too risky to take into this young organization, where, bear in mind, a major fuck-up could potentially mean the death of the entire organization, they were quietly disposed of. There were even those wizards and magic users who, either wanting the protection of the Empire or seeing in which way the wind was blowing, showed up and surrendered themselves even without the dream encouragements. Those who did not obey either the dreams or show up at Talabheim of their own accord were swiftly hunted down and executed by Teclis and his compatriots. And so, in days, weeks, and months, the High Elves had achieved what the Witch Hunters and the Templars could not in years, decades, and centuries. And surprisingly, however, this did not necessarily endear them to the witch hunters or the Templars. They were not particularly fond of being upstaged, but they couldn't really complain about a lack of efficiency, now could they? At the moment, the colleges of magics were unassailable by their efforts. Now, I'm sure they were hoping for a bit of a fuck-up, but the first batch of disciples did not provide the witch hunters or the Templars with easy pickings. And indeed, the first crop of battle wizards were to prove invaluable in the Empire's efforts to repel the Chaos Hordes, and several of them would even bravely and unselfishly give their own lives in service of the Empire. After this, the status and position of the colleges were so firmly fixed within the framework of the Empire that not even the once powerful witch hunters and Templar orders could possibly argue against their efficiency and continued existence. This recognition did not come without effort, however. Realizing that time was of the essence, Teclis set about teaching the young budding members of the colleges the most simplistic and basic forms of spells to begin with, the ones that would be immediately useful in fighting the Chaos Hordes. Fireballs, lightning strikes, clouds of poison, and of course healing. It was perhaps this last use that was the most drastic departure from the previously established ways of warfare. I mean, a fireball or a lightning strike is neat and all, but at the end of the day, that's nothing that good old-fashioned artillery cannot replicate with a fair bit of accuracy. Healing, however, well, at this point, the Empire's medical knowledge consisted mostly of, this limb appears to have taken on a strange shade of purplish green. Perhaps we should lop it off before the rest of the body assumes that very same color. Or maybe we should just stick some leeches on it. They fix everything. Right? Not right, sadly. If only the leeches were such miraculous creatures, there would be much less suffering in the world. And whilst, relatively speaking, these were simple things, by high elf standards, they were endlessly intricate and complex for their new students. It took quite a while for them to learn even these basics, which, might seem like, oh, poor little humans can't into magic. Well, yeah, kinda. They can't really compare to the high elves who have had hundreds, if not thousands of years to study and learn, but the young humans surprised the high elves in their fervor. They would throw themselves into their studies unlike anything the high elves had ever seen, and probably motivated by the fact that they would only be around for 100 years tops. They couldn't exactly afford to take the slow and steady route. And slowly but surely, they became better and better at guiding and directing the winds of magics. In this way, they aided in the battle against chaos, and once the Great War was won, the question then became what to do with all of these wizards, all of these sorcerers, all of these apprentices of the three High Elves. Because up until this point, the whole project had been somewhat improvised in nature. The organization, which up until this point I've been referring to the colleges, might more correctly be referred to as a working project under the command of Teclis and with the more or less official seal of Magnus the Pious, but it was not yet fully the organization that the Empire would come to know as the Colleges of Magic. The full and official founding of those orders happened shortly after the war. Magnus, having seen the effect of wizardry firsthand in the war against chaos, and also having seen the foul powers of the enemy twice now, was not overly enthused about the idea of disbanding this order that had proven so very useful, especially as Magnus also was not entirely convinced, wisely so, that the eternal enemy of chaos had been defeated once and for all. He was not about to let his wizards go. There were challenges, however, because Teclix, whilst he had probably already planned this out from the very beginning, some of his compatriots were not quite as happy with allowing the humans full control of a magic and teaching them all of its myriad secrets. Fenrir refused originally to help found the colleges of magic, stating that the humans with the power of magic might even grow to be a dangerous rival to the High Elves, and might even turn their magics upon those who once taught them. Teclix, however, argued that the Empire was potentially becoming a foe with Ulthuan, at least on a limited scale. Ulthuan itself was no longer strong enough to wage a war against chaos in its entirety. Ulthuan needed allies, and the humans, albeit rambunctious and occasionally difficult to predict, could usually be relied upon to, at least act in their best interest. And when massive hordes of savage barbarians were descending from the north, led by armies of bloodthirsty demons, aforementioned best interest were usually quite predictable. It might even lead to the loss of high elf lives in the short term, but Teclix argued that in the long view, the humans would act as a bulwark against chaos, and would shield Ulthuan from far greater danger if they were able to do so. Eventually, after lengthy discussions, this, whilst it perhaps did not entirely convince Fenrir, it at the very least allowed him to save face, to acquiesce to Teclix's greater knowledge and forethought. And so the 8 Orders of Magic were officially formed. But they would have to find a new home. Talabheim was too far away. Magnus the Pious had taken Altdorf as the imperial capital, and he was going to move there personally and wanted his mages to be within easy reach, both so that he could access their research, their knowledge, and their advice, and so that he could potentially crush them with the Reichsguard, should such extreme measures be necessary. Remember, Magnus might have been a remarkably forward-thinking and progressive individual, but these were still basically walking, talking, ticking nuclear devices we were talking about here. And once you gathered 100 of them in the same place, well, Chernobyl was a good idea on paper until the Russians actually built it, and then it was suddenly a less good idea. It also led to a mass exodus of Altdorf, because up until this point, the populace had been assured that, the wizards would help with the war effort, or even just like, what wizards? No, the Empire isn't recognizing wizards. Silly peasants. That's just the High Elves doing that shit. But once an official college was formed and placed in the imperial capital, well, it was getting damned hard to ignore, wasn't it? However, after a few decades of Altdorf not disappearing into a massive chaos rift or being struck by Sigmar's divine wrath, people slowly but surely began to return. Oh, and on that note, Sigmar's divine wrath. Now, in the Warhammer world, there is technically not a whole lot of difference between miracles and magic. It is more in the eyes of the beholder, really. The priests of Sigmar's are adamant about the perceived fact that they do not conjure magic. Magic is a foul, impure thing. Magic is the tool of mysticism, the tool of chaos, the tool of the enemy, and is to be distrusted. Most severely so. Whereas the miracles called down by the warrior priests and the faithful of Sigmar, or of Ulrich, they are not magic. They are granted by the deity, by Sigmar or by Ulrich, and therefore are pure and clean powers. Of course, this is sadly not quite the case. Now, do bear in mind that the strict mental rotas of the priests, their own self-indoctrination almost, do unintentionally give them a very good control over their magic. Essentially, magic does whatever you tell it to do, as long as you tell it in a stern and determined voice, shall we say. If a priest is entirely convinced that 1. His magic is not magic at all, but rather a miracle, and 2. He only uses the established forms of prayer and ways of calling upon this divine power, then, well, he's pretty damn safe. If this magical formula, shall we say, has been proven to achieve this one thing, then reiterating and recreating that precise magic formula, well, 99.9% of the time, that will result in the very same thing. It is only when you start experimenting and twisting and turning the magic that it has a little bit more of a tendency to get interesting. That is not to say that a priest cannot accidentally create a little warp rift here and there, it's just to say that it is less likely than in the hands of a mage. Now, of course, Teclix was painfully aware of this, but he did not wish to create a diplomatic scene with the populace of the Empire. And so, when the Grand Theogonist and the warrior priests informed him that, oh no, we are not mages, we are priests, he simply just nodded along happily and smiled, making sure to keep his mouth well and truly shut, whilst probably on the inside going, oh, that's adorable little furless monkey, oh yes, no, of course your magic isn't magic. How silly of me. I've only studied this shit for 10,000 years. How could I not realize that this is divine power, not magic? Adorable little monkegs. No, wait. That's the Eldar, not the High Elves. Same fucking difference, I suppose. And the college's troubles were, of course, not at an end after having been officially established. Indeed, one could easily say that this was when the real problems started. At this early point in the college's history, its Grand Master was Teclix himself, and thusly the loyalty of the various students was to Teclix first, and then to Magnus second. This was perhaps not ideal, many within the Empire would say, but Magnus did not seem to have much of a problem with it. He viewed it more as a benefit/risk scenario. On the one hand, yes, the ultimate loyalty of the mages would not technically be to him first, but Teclix did not strike him like the kind of guy he would want to take over the Empire. At all, basically. And Magnus did not trust anyone else either to take control of the colleges. He could give control over it to one of the other mages, but let's be honest, that would be like the blind leading the blind, since all of their combined knowledge about magic would probably not even amount to an iota of Teclix's own understanding. And Magnus couldn't really just hand it over to some noble within the Empire either, because, well, once the High Elf may have no interest in ruling the Empire, other Imperial nobles very well might. And so this continued for quite some time, with the colleges involving themselves more and more in the Empire's politics, and getting involved as well through choices not entirely of their own making. The nobles, of course, immediately seeing a pretty shiny new thing, ask the most important question. How can this benefit me? And so they set about gaming the system, getting their own private court wizards, getting their loyalty to themselves first and foremost, and seeing what, if anything, could be done with said loyalty. This resulted in more official legislation and control over the colleges. The colleges, in return, responded with a bit more backlash, trying to lobby for more freedom for themselves, whilst trying to limit the influence of the nobles, which of course in turn led to the nobles seeing if they couldn't get a little bit more personal influence, and so on and so on. Eventually, the system evolved over decades and centuries with all of these various power structures in mind. The colleges, the individual wizards, the imperial administration, the emperor personally, the various elector counts and nobles, and of course the army. That being one of the key organizations to make use of the wizard's services. The complete oversight of all of these rules and regulations would be far too complex to get into here, but suffice to say that wizards act almost exclusively on behest of the state, the empire as a whole. Now, this first and foremost means on behalf of the empire's armies, which usually are under the command of various elector counts, or of course the emperor himself personally. As for their actions on behalf of the Empire in a wider sense, acting as advisors, astrologers, healers, etc., that usually comes under the purview of the various local nobles, who might employ them for a specific task, might employ them as advisors, as aides, as researchers, etc., etc. In this way, the power structure of the colleges, the nobles, the emperor, the army, and everything else are maintained in a nice and diluted state, where overall control over the colleges simultaneously lies in the hands of the various masters of the colleges, the emperor, local nobles, and military officials, ensuring that no single entity has complete control over this very, very valuable resource. And now here at the end, let us talk a bit about the colleges of magic specifically. And with that I mean their organizational structure. Of course, it is made up, as mentioned, of several different orders. The Light Order, the Celestial Order, the Gold Order, the Jade Order, the Amber Order, the Bright Order, the Grey Order, and the Amethyst Order. These orders have their own practices, their own schools of magics, their own lines of research, their own masters, and their own, to some degree, organizational system. But I'm not going to get into them here. Those are probably better left for their own specific videos. Instead, we are now going to talk about the overall structural order of the colleges, because it is a rather fascinating little thing. First and foremost, where do they get their recruits, now that Teclix, of course, is no longer around to run the colleges directly and search out mages? Well, to begin with, that was certainly a bit of a problem, but as the order grew in influence and wealth, and the clear and apparent benefits of being a member of the various orders became obvious to pretty much anyone and everyone, a lot of people just joined up naturally because, well, it seemed like the smart thing to do. And as for those born in more affluent families, those who could potentially hide a child with a magical gift or two, they too tend to hand them over quite obediently, because if they are discovered to harbor illegal sorcerers, then of course the punishment will not just affect the magic user in question. It will bring the loyalty of the entire clan, the merchant guild, or the noble family into question. And with how thorough and overzealous the witch hunters can tend to be, yeah, it's better to hand over young Otto before he gets too much in the way of attention. And as for normal people, well, there are of course those who don't wish to enter, who value their freedom more than the relative safety and security that the position of an apprentice and eventual magister provides, but well, these individuals are unavoidable. Even if you make it illegal to be a hedge wizard, that isn't going to get rid of all of the hedge wizards. Just most of them, as the vast majority see the sense in joining an official organization. Because, well, it sure as hell pays the bills, and if you do well, the Empire will actually not only pay you for your services, but also pay you for your research, and allow you to live in a state of, well, not luxury per se, perhaps, but considering the alternative of a hedge wizard living in some brambled abode, everything is, of course, relative. Though bear in mind that a life of opulence is most definitively not on the books, and this of course only if you can even get into the orders in the first place. If you are a wizard, you will be taken into some of the smaller orders, certainly, but that does not mean you get access to the colleges of magic in Altdorf. You may be trained to be essentially a wage slave of the state for all eternity, if you are simply just a minor wizard or practitioner of magic. Your application to the colleges may never be accepted, or if it is, you may never rise through the ranks, or hell, you might not even be able to afford the entrance fee, which, well, to the proper colleges, the entrance fee is basically everything you own. So, it is a little bit of a roll of the dice as to whether or not you will ever be able to get out of them. This is why, to begin with in the video, I compared the colleges to a little bit of a golden cage. Because again, whilst, hell, being guaranteed a bed and 3 square meals a day is relatively decent in the Empire, considering there are significant portions of the population that don't even have that, you do not have a lot of freedom, and any freedom you do hope to eventually achieve will only come at great cost and at great effort. A great deal of research is required, and even should you rise to the lofty height of an official college magician of one of the orders, you still have to give 10% of your total earnings to the colleges each and every year. Though, well, considering my own fucking tax bracket, 10% sounds goddamn reasonable. And if you rise high enough in the order, you don't even have to pay any taxes. Which tends to be what happens when you let the higher-ups determine their own tax brackets. Odd, that. Bit of a coincidence, really. So how do people actually get into the proper orders then? Well, there is of course a simple application, and the orders will then determine whether or not you are a suitable individual to receive their learning and knowledge, which your chances may or may not be aided by a suitably sized donation. Just saying. Alternatively, you can also be taken as an apprentice by an active mage. This is probably one of the most common ways of getting into one of the orders, to be taken under the wing of one person that is already educated by the orders, as they are free to take apprentices and use them as, well, de facto slaves, essentially, and then refer them to the orders one point in the future. Or just, pump them and dump them, and that's it. It's not like the master has any real obligation towards the student, as it is very much so an unofficial type of system. And once you are in, there is no getting out. Once you are an order magician, or hell, just any magician officially recognized by the Empire, that's it. You can't just quit one day and go do something else. You can't be a magister and then decide, you know what, I've always enjoyed making mules violate one another in a sexual fashion. I shall become a mule breeder. No, that is not how it works. You are this until you die, and if you try to break with the order, you become an outcast. Best case scenario, they simply strip you of your title and all of your money and powers and research, etc., and make you into an outcast. Which, that's public disgrace, and you'll probably be a powerless beggar for the rest of your life, but Well, you're alive and free, I suppose. If, however, you were to turn against the colleges, or start pursuing lines of magic that they are not comfortable with, because there are still those arts within the world of magics that is considered far too dark for any respectable member of the colleges to dabble with, then you will be hunted down and you will be eliminated. If you're lucky, the colleges will catch you before the witch hunters do, and they'll put a rather quick end to your heretical ways, because they're not really interested in anyone learning about their missteps. The colleges are, well, as mentioned, hardly the most beloved or trusted organizations as it is, and if word starts leaking out of rogue magisters sacrificing children to demons, yeah, that would certainly do a bit of a number on their reputation. So they prefer to deal with rogues under the table if at possible, although they do have a more public way of doing it as well. If it becomes public knowledge that a magister has turned to the dark arts, then the colleges will seek to hunt them down and capture them alive, preferably, so that they may be placed on public trial, convicted, and then executed via a particularly drawn-out process, where the soul is literally shorn apart, where the mage's magic, the very essence of his being, is drawn away and cut out of his flesh. It is, as it sounds, an exceptionally slow and torturous process. Just imagine, as a mage, having had this special power that has been a part of you for as long as you can possibly remember, as indispensable to you as your sight, your hearing, your sense of touch, smell, and taste all combined, being shorn from your body iota by iota, all to the rapacious cheering of the crowds. Yeah. It sets an example, to put it mildly, to the point that it has only ever been done 6 times. Those 6 times having proven more than enough over the last 250-odd years to ensure that the rest of the hopefuls get the message. Nothing quite like a public execution/torture session to get the rest in line, after all, and to reassure the public. Surely, after seeing that, there will be no one left to question whether or not the colleges truly do everything in their power to hunt down and thoroughly chastise those who go against their orders. And with that, I will wrap up this video on the colleges of magic. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.